Okay. Everything that you need is, of course, in your textbooks, but I thought it might be helpful to you as you're reviewing some of this for the test and ultimately really to learn the material, to go over with you in a lecture here a little bit about the abolitionist movement through this time. We've talked about the reform movements, temperance, um, the women's rights movements. We talked a little bit about some of the other important movements that were taking place in the same period. The movement for better conditions in prisons, better conditions uh, for mentally ill people, people with what we would call now developmental disabilities. If you remember, I mentioned Dorothea Dix, who really tried to professionalize what were called at the time insane or lunatic asylums. Um, so let's talk a little bit about abolitionism uh, as we go here, because it all comes of a piece. Um, what you're looking at here is the front page of the first edition of The Liberator, which you should know is William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. You see 1831 there. He launches it. Garrison had been active in abolitionist um, agitation before that, but this is when he starts the newspaper. And famously, of course, if we look down here, we have his, there we go, his famous uh, statement, I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. That set of lines there is not only in the first edition of his newspaper, but it then becomes the rallying cry for abolitionists after that, in the handbills they give out and the banners that they put up when they're advertising with posters, public meetings or lectures or what have you. That little set of phrases there becomes really the symbol of the abolitionist movement. So before we get to Garrison, let's talk about a few um, matters on background to that. Okay, so first of all, let's remind ourselves a little bit of the history of slavery in the country. Chesapeake Bay economy in the region around Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, was originally built with slave labor. They needed in Virginia to run the tobacco plantations, and you did not have a clear distinction in the 1600s in Virginia between a slave and a servant. Remember, you had that mixture of slaves and indentured servants, and it tended more toward slavery when the indentured servants stopped coming over and it became too expensive and too much of a problem. By the time you get into the early 1700s, you begin to get the slave codes, which you should remember again from previous chapters. The slave codes really are what legalized turning black people into property, what's called chattels. Chattel is piece of property rather than as a person. A chattel could be an object, it could be a pig, it could be a cow, and it could be a slave. And that's really what gave the legal background basis to slavery. As the tobacco market sort of began to slow down, slave labor was less important. Virginia farmers really switch the crops that they're working on. The Chesapeake Bay's economy changes, and you need fewer slaves. Why? Because the number of slaves that you need to run a cattle farm or even a grain farm is a lot less than a tobacco farm. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. You have to tend. I don't want to go into a whole agricultural thing here, but you have to tend tobacco plants much more carefully. You have to look after them almost on a daily basis. They have to be harvested the right way. They're harvested by hand. It takes just more people, more manpower. When they switch out of the tobacco economy into other things, I'm not saying they completely eliminate tobacco, but when they switch into other things, slaves are less necessary. Okay, so it looks like the slave economy in the South is on the decline until Eli Whitney comes along. And the cotton gin, as it's called, really, and that's 1793, right? You should know that. The cotton gin suddenly makes growing cotton a much more lucrative crop. It was so labor-intensive to do cotton and such a pain in the neck that you couldn't make a huge amount of money on it. But when England, as we talked about previously, began to industrialize a bit, that is, its factories became much better. If it could process more cotton, it needed more cotton. And the American South suddenly could produce more because the cotton gin made it possible to process cotton more easily and faster. To process cotton. That is, once you pick the cotton, to take the cotton, clean it, take the seeds out of it, and get it ready for turning into cloth. However, harvesting cotton, once again, was a very labor-intensive thing. If you just think about it, picture it, even if you don't know a lot about agriculture. If you're growing wheat, right? Wheat is like a tall grass. It is actually a tall grass. You go in there, you cut down the field. So you have a scythe, the great big long blade. You cut down the field, bundle it up, harvest it. It takes manpower. But with cotton, you have these, if you've never seen a cotton plant, maybe I should just show you a cotton plant, right? There you go. There's a cotton plant. You see you have these little buds on the tips of this sort of bushy kind of like plant. And when the buds are ripe, really what a cotton plant is that the seeds are in the cotton. And the idea of it is when the plant is ready, the bud is ripe, the bud bursts open, and then the wind or passing animals would sort of catch the cotton balls, which would blow them away, and then a new cotton plant would be planted. That's what nature intends for how cotton plants are supposed to grow. When we grow cotton, when human beings grow cotton, you want to harvest that. That's going to be your cotton fiber. Okay. To harvest it, though, you can't just go in with a great big thresher and whack all these plants down. Somebody has to walk down the rows by hand and pluck these things off one by one. Now, nowadays we have more automated methods of doing it, but back in the day, you didn't. So you needed a lot of human beings who would go out into the cotton fields and pick that cotton, and it was a lot of bending over and all of that. So it was very labor intensive. So the Whitney's cotton gin really is what revives, if you will, the need for slaves in the South. But cotton doesn't grow every place. It's a plant that needs a certain climate, and that meant, as I said to you previously, the deep South. So not so much Virginia or Tennessee or Kentucky, but Alabama, Mississippi, down there. So all of a sudden you have this burst in the in the need for slaves down there. And as I mentioned to you in class, the cotton production really explodes from maybe 9,000 or 10,000 bales in 1791 to about 4 million plus bales by the time of the Civil War. Okay, so the cotton economy changes the South's attitudes. This is something else that's not often recognized. There was abolitionism in the South. There were people in the South, actually, who thought that slavery was not a good thing, for a variety of reasons. Some people had a moral objection. Some people just thought, having all of these other people around, these black people around, wasn't such a hot idea. Eventually the slaves might revolt. It's just sort of good to sort of do away with this whole thing. So for whatever reason, you did have abolitionism in the South. But that starts to go away by the time you get to around the 1820s. Why? Because the cotton production becomes so important in the South. Something like, leave it at that. Cotton production becomes so important in the South. So they really become dependent on slaves to make the economy run. That begins to change the attitudes in the South, and certainly changes the direction of Southern development. If cotton is all important as your cash crop and your economy crop, then, cities, you're not really looking to grow your cities. You need a lot of land for cotton. So, whereas in the North, the Industrial Revolution takes off, and you start to see this growth of cities, because where you want to put your factories in places that have good transportation and people can get to and all that. In the South, less interest in that. It's more about pushing out and finding new land that you can turn into cotton fields. So the South doesn't develop an urban economy, and therefore you have less in the way of what shall we call traditional middle class. Who's going to be your middle class in the South? You're not going to have. You have some cities. You do have some cities, Atlanta and Charleston, but that's not where most people are. Where is your middle class going to be? Well, it's going to be sort of individual farmers. So if you think about it, in the South, among whites, you had three classes of people. The planters, that is the guys who owned the big plantations. This is maybe 4 or 5% of the population. They own huge amounts of land and large numbers of slaves, very wealthy, and really the plantations, these southern states are sort of collections of these big plantations. The middle group, if you will, economically in the South, are going to be individual farmers, what are sometimes called yeoman farmers. The word yeoman means a lot of things in history. Here it just means sort of guys who are not tenant farmers. That is, they own the land they're on. They're not renting it from one of the big plantation owners. But they're sort of independent. So they run their own farm. They have their own family. Most of the yeoman farmers did not own any slaves, not out of any kind of grand conviction about human rights, but simply because they couldn't afford them, and they didn't particularly need them to run their farm. Some of the yeoman farmers may have owned a few, a couple, 1, 2, 3, but most of them probably did not own any. The yeoman farmers outnumbered the planters. Yeah. So maybe I should, and if you're just writing down what I'm putting on the screen here, you're cooked. So be taking good notes on this. Anyway, so you have the planters, you have the yeoman farmers. The planters, we said, maybe 4 or 5% of the population. The yeoman farmers way outnumber the planters, way outnumber them in terms of number, but not in terms of economic power. You think today there's a lot of argument about the fact that you have the 1% and the 99%, and whatever 1, 2, 3% of the population owns 80% of the wealth, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, it was that kind of a situation in the South. That 4 or 5% who were the plantation owners, even though they were a tiny minority, they held the power. They held the economic power. They held most of the land. They had the most influence. So that middle class of yeoman farmers they're out there working on their fields. And then the third group are poor whites. This is hard to say how many of them there were. You get estimates down to 20% of the population. You have estimates as high as almost half the population, 50%. They're a big chunk. Let's say that. There are at least as many poor whites as there are yeoman farmers. Okay. And who do we mean by poor whites? Well, these were folks who did not own their own farms. They were mostly unskilled laborers, so they didn't own a shop in town. They were not carpenters or blacksmiths or something. They often lived out in the backwoods on their own, or sometimes they were hired hands for the yeoman farmers, or hired to work for the planters. Again, the poor whites were not particularly interested in human rights either. In fact, they were very supportive of slavery and of treating blacks as slaves. Why? Because it gave them somebody to look down on. I mean, think about it. If you're the low man on the totem pole, it's kind of nice to know that there's somebody underneath you. Well, at least I'm better than them, and that somehow makes me superior. I mentioned this to you before. If you look at today, if you see on the news the guys who are in the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Nation, these other racist outfits, you look at these guys and, I mean, my God, what a group of losers. These gap-toothed, illiterate, tattooed all over their body, with screaming nuts, with all sorts of criminal convictions, and you begin to see why they're so racist. They're really at the bottom of the ladder of society, and they want somebody else to look down on. So this was the situation of the poor whites in the South. Okay, now, don't forget that the slave trade was outlawed in when? You should know. Constitution, 1808. Remember, the Constitution said that you couldn't outlaw slave trade until 1808, but in 1808 it was over. Now, the trade meant trade from Africa. So you couldn't import more slaves into the United States after 1808, but you could still hold slaves in the United States. And so after 1808, you have the slave trade in the United States is internal, if you will. So if slaves are born on a plantation, the guy can sell those slaves to others. Now, I started off talking here for a minute about Southern abolitionism. As I said, you had some people in the South who were in favor of ending slavery, but that wanes. And why does Southern abolitionism wane? Well, first of all, the South becomes increasingly dependent on slavery after 1793. And then you have a series of slave rebellions. Mention is made of them in your textbook. So if you look on page, where am I? Well, first of all, you should remember the Stono Rebellion. We've talked about that before. That came a fair amount back. And then, okay, page 384, you should notice, about halfway down the page, you have Denmark Vesey. He's not in boldface, but you should be aware of him. Denmark Vesey, Vesey, was a free black man. You did have slaves that were given their freedom by their owners in the South. Sometimes they managed to find a way to buy their freedom. Sometimes the owner, emancipated them on their deathbed. They just gave them their freedom. Sometimes owners found them too expensive to keep. If your farm is going bankrupt or something, and you didn't think you could get a good price, you might free them. For whatever reason, there were such things as free blacks. Denmark Vesey was a free black, but in 1822 he led a rebellion. This is in Carolina, which was a real mess, and it scared the living daylights out of people. Denmark Vesey, a slave uprising really scares everybody, because if it can happen in Charleston, South Carolina, which was where Vesey was, it could happen on my farm. It could happen on my plantation. Yeah, you had slaves all over the South. In 1831, when you had the Nat Turner Rebellion, this scared people even more. Nat Turner Rebellion was Denmark Vesey was small. He only had about 30 people with him, as I think your book says, and they were all executed. It was all over fairly quickly. The Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, this was much more scary. Turner thought of himself as a prophet. He thought of himself as a religious figure. And he gathered a group of people who were convinced that he was going to be the great leader of the revolt and lead them all to freedom, and ran around Virginia attacking families. Killed something like 60 white families, and families, not just the men, but the women and the children too. And this really terrified the Southerners. So any sympathy that people had for, well, maybe we should treat these people better, wanes by that time. People are so scared of a slave rebellion, it kind of disappears. So slavery goes from being a so-called necessary evil, something we needed, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and starts to be, necessary evil. What do we mean? Well, we have to have it. Look, it's not great. We're not happy with having slaves and slave trade. It's not healthy for society. But you know what? We've got to have it if we're going to make this economy run, and maybe eventually we'll kind of get rid of it, and we'll slowly, make it go away, etc., etc. By the 1830s, it was being thought of as a positive good. Where the Southern leadership is no longer apologizing for slavery. Oh, we know it's kind of icky, but, it's something we have to do. And they're actually arguing in favor of slavery. They're twisting quotes from the Bible to justify it. They're talking about how, well, the black people, they couldn't take care of themselves, and look, these nice masters are making sure they have a warm place to stay and food to eat and all this. And they're presenting this sort of fiction to themselves that they're doing the blacks a favor by taking care of them. Almost as if they're like stray animals or something along these lines, which is a big shift in thinking and kind of what will we say, rationalization for this. Okay, so let's then think just briefly about slavery in the North. As we mentioned, there was slavery in the North, but that was gradually abolished about the same time that you're having this shift in the South. By the 1820s, when slavery is going from a gee whiz necessary evil to, hey, we shouldn't really be apologizing for this, this is a positive good, and when slavery is going from well, okay, this is what we're doing because we kind of always did it, to, oh boy, we really need slaves if we're going to make this cotton economy work. In the North, at the same time, slavery is disappearing. You had gradual abolition. Some states did away with slavery quickly. Others slowly stopped the slave trade and then stopped any new buying of slaves, and then on a date certain they said, okay, now any slave that still exists in the state is hereby freed. And so by the 1820s, that's the case in New York and a lot of other places. But you also have at that time really the starts of this abolitionist movement. Now, how come? Let's recall, first of all, the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was, that religious revival, which swept across the country, and that tent revivalism and all that, we've talked about it. One of the effects of the Second Great Awakening in some places was making them think about the moral demands of the Scriptures, of the Gospels. In the South, they did try to twist biblical quotes to justify slavery, but it's kind of hard to read the words of Jesus Christ and walk away a big slave supporter. It's not a surprise, therefore, that there was a strong connection between the religious revivalism and the launch of abolitionism. One of the great religious preachers as a redundancy, one of the great preachers of the Second Great Awakening was a guy named Lyman Beecher, who I think I've mentioned to you before. Lyman Beecher was part of this sort of tent revival, setting the world on fire with the Bible stuff. Influential guy, one of the most famous of them. It's not a surprise that he has a bunch of kids, two of whom are Harriet Beecher, who comes to be known as Harriet Beecher Stowe when she marries a guy named Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was this stunningly important book. It's not from a literary standpoint, it's a boring book, and it's kind of melodramatic, and it's not necessarily the greatest thing in English literature. But it was a monster bestseller, particularly in the North. And its depiction of slavery and the really humanizing these slaves and the horrors they face and the struggles of a mother trying to reunite with her lost husband and trying to protect her little child as Simon Legree and his men and dogs are chasing her down. I mean, it's very dramatic. It had huge influence on people's attitudes in the North. I should also point out it was almost instantly turned into various versions of stage productions. So, people would go to the theater and see this replayed again and again on stage. So, Beecher's daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, this is one of the great impetuses, and Beecher had a son, Henry Ward Beecher, a graduate of Amherst College, by the way. Henry Ward Beecher, who wound up in Brooklyn as a preacher. We don't think of Brooklyn as a great intellectual center, but up through the early 1900s, Brooklyn is still sometimes referred to as the city of churches. It was even back then. There was a church on every block, and great and famous preachers and religious thinkers in Brooklyn, great scholars in Brooklyn, great writers. I mean, it was the city of many of the great writers. We talked about Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle for a while. So you had a lot of intellectualism and a lot of religiosity in Brooklyn. Henry Ward Beecher was a preacher in Brooklyn for many years, and was again one of the leading lights of abolitionism. It's not a surprise that they are the children, literally, of the Second Great Awakening. So that set some of the stage. You had had some previous talk about what to do about slaves. Your book makes reference to the American Colonization Society. Colonization Society. This is 1817, but this is sometimes you hear referred to as like the Back to Africa movement. A number of freed blacks, again, some who had managed to find ways to buy their freedom, some who had been given it as gifts as a result. You remember back the American Revolution. Some were freed for having signed up for that. Some were simply given it by their masters for various reasons. Anyway, you had freed blacks in the United States, and there was a movement, a question of, well, what should we do with them? And there were a lot of people who, even though it's great, they're free, didn't really want them sticking around, those people. So the American Colonization Society was their idea. They were founded to advocate for the gradual abolition of slavery. We're not saying we're going to steal all your slaves at once and you're going to be left, you white planters, having lost all your investment. We will bar any further trade with Africa, right? That's already been done. Then we'll bar buying and selling of slaves, and then we will say that children of slaves are therefore free, and then we'll set a date at which the other slaves are free. So we do this in stages. But what's the goal? What do you do with all these free blacks? We'll send them back to Africa. And so it was under the sponsorship of American Colonization Society that the country of Liberia, Libera, was founded. That's in the red there, on the coast of Africa. Now, there's the Sahara Desert, so you're in sub-Saharan Africa here, which means below the Sahara. Over the Sahara, on the Mediterranean, that's all largely Arab, or they're not all technically Arabs up there, the Berbers and so on, but Arab influenced. Below the Sahara, you have what's sometimes called Black Africa, and Liberia is right there. Liberia, of course, from the Latin for free, liber. So the nation of freedom. And let me pull in. Okay. Oops, there we go. No, I want to pull out just a little bit. There we go. And the idea was we would free these blacks and then send them all back to where they came from. And so the country of Liberia was created uh, to give them a place to go. You notice, by the way, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named for James Monroe, who was the president at the time that the colony was founded, the president of the United States. So it was a tip of the hat to him. Unfortunately, the American Colonization Society's approach never really took off. About 12,000 blacks, and I call them blacks. Why? Because to call them African Americans at this point minimizes what they were up against. A freed black was not treated as an American. Sad to say, but that's the case. So these freed blacks, there were only about 12,000 of them that went back to Liberia between, say, 1817, when the American Colonization Society was founded, and the Civil War. 12,000. That may sound like a lot to you, but realize there were maybe 4.5 million black slaves in the American South. So it was a drop in the bucket. It really was a drop in the bucket. It also, the very idea of the American Colonization Society was kind of patronizing. Yeah, they believed in freedom for slaves, but they also believed that that blacks could not be integrated into American society. They could not simply become part of American society, that there was an unconquerable prejudice, as Henry Clay put it, and that it would be better for everybody if they just disappeared and went back to Africa. Okay. I just point out to you, by the way, Liberia has been in the middle of some difficult bloodshed. This will never be on the AP, but Sierra Leone, you see, is on one side, and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, is on the other side. And this is a very unstable area of Africa. There's a tremendous amount of fighting over resources there. But and so Liberia, which has been historically a rather stable country, has unfortunately been caught in sort of the pinchers here of violence. Okay. The big granddaddy, though, of abolitionism, was not the American Colonization Society. It was William Lloyd Garrison. And you know about him, you've read about him in your books. Garrison originally was involved with the American Colonization Society, but grew increasingly impatient with them. Garrison was a real reformer. He was involved with the women's rights movement, the temperance movement, all of that sort of thing. And he believed from day one that the right thing to do was to end slavery because it was an affront to human dignity. He really did. He's an admirable guy in that sense, because you had a wide range among the abolitionists of attitude. You had those who believed it was slavery was a harmful institution for society, wasn't healthy for society. You had those, and so let's get rid of it. You had those who thought it was unkind. But Garrison was one of those who believed it was, in fact, a violation of human dignity. That's a very advanced and admirable notion at the time. Anyway, he got involved with the Colonization Society, but it's sort of there was nothing better to get involved with, but becomes impatient and believes that their approach is never really going to end slavery. I mean, it might give a way for freed blacks to have some options, but it wasn't really going to end slavery. He started off, even though Garrison is usually associated with Boston, he begins in Baltimore. And don't forget, Baltimore's in Maryland, and Maryland is a southern state. The Mason-Dixon line which has also been mentioned in your book, is really Mason and Dixon were two surveyors who set the line, Mason's and Dixon's line, that is the southern border of Pennsylvania. You can go look it up on a map yourself. And if any of you have driven from Maryland into Pennsylvania, there's markers on all the roads of where Mason's and Dixon's line is. South of that line is slavery country, and Maryland was a slave country. Baltimore had slave auctions, and so Garrison saw this as a kid in Baltimore, I should say, young man really, when he began his newspaper career. He saw it firsthand, and it really radicalized him, so that when he was about 25 or 26, he moved to Boston to start his own new newspaper, The Liberator, that we mentioned, the purpose of which was to end slavery. And he was considered a radical because he believed in ending slavery immediately, completely, and without compensation to the owners. No paying off the slave owners to protect them from economic loss. No slow, gradual, none of that. Garrison's dream was that, somebody would snap their fingers and slavery would be ended now, and if a slave owner got economically screwed for it, tough, That was considered the radical view, as opposed to, say, the most moderate view among abolitionists. The most moderate view would have been that of the Free Soilers. And the Free Soilers simply said, slavery's no good, slavery sucks, but what we should really do is simply not extend it any farther than it is. So we'll leave slavery alone in the South and hope that someday it's no longer economically feasible and slavery sort of dies a natural death. But our thing will be that we won't extend it to any of the new states and new territories. Garrison was considered radical because he said that's not nearly enough. The Liberator, his newspaper, was a small paper. It had its circulation. I mean, you have to realize, what major newspapers are. The Liberator circulation was never more than a few thousand. But it really had a much greater significance than its numbers would expect. Garrison was the intellectual leader of the radical abolitionists. And Garrison founded his own organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society, which really was the most progressive of the abolitionists, and was remarkably progressive. If you ever see photographs of the members, as here, you'll notice there are a bunch of folks there, but you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women in this particular group. This is the American Anti-Slavery Society, I believe, in Ohio. You have women were as important and as much a member of this group as men were. So you have famously you have women like the Grimke sisters, the more important of whom was Sarah Moore Grimke. And I should pull that up. There she is. Yes, I know. She's a very pleasant-looking woman. Sarah Moore Grimke, Grimke, was one of the key leaders. She was a leader, just like Garrison, of both the women's rights movement and of the abolitionist movement. and was part of that whole religious. I mean, there was a very strong religious basis to it. So uh, um, there was, they tapped into the local churches, to that Second Great Awakening kind of crowd. They were mostly middle class men and women, relatively well educated and very religious, who were involved in this. And Garrison faced some pretty heavy opposition within his own group because, for two reasons really. First of all, because Garrison insisted on having women as prominent parts of his group. So you had a split among abolitionists. There were people who believed in the abolition of slavery who did not believe in equal rights for women. So that caused some tension. And second, because there were abolitionists. Abolitionists existed on a range of a spectrum of opposition to slavery. So they ran from Garrison and the sort of immediate uncompensated freedom for all slaves to the Free Soilers, who eventually started their own political party, the Free Soil Party in 1848. They would become largely the Republican Party. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, at the start of the Civil War, would not have been classed as an abolitionist. He would have been classed as a free soiler. Lincoln himself said, my job is to keep the Union together. If I can do that by freeing the slaves, I'll do it. If I can do it by leaving the slaves in bondage, I'll do that. And if I can do it by freeing some slaves and leaving others in bondage, I'll do that too. Lincoln was not happy with slavery, but wanted a very sort of pragmatic, practical solution. And going into the Civil War, he was a free soiler. He wasn't calling for the abolition of slavery in the South. He just didn't want it extended to the rest of the country. That was considered the moderate position. Okay, so then let's talk about Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a rather amazing guy. He had been born in a slave in Maryland. Again, we tend not to think of Maryland as a southern state, but it really was. He was born there in 1820. Let me think a minute. No, 1817. Right, 1817. So just at sort of the beginning of this whole process, he was born to a woman, a mother who was a slave. His father was white, so he was the product of slave rape. He learns to read and write, which is pretty astounding for a black at the time, because, and that's not, that's because blacks were deliberately kept illiterate by slave owners. In fact, to teach a black to write in the South was a hanging offense. He, at about the age of 21, he escapes from slavery and comes north. So now we're talking around the year 1838. 1838, Garrison is already underway. The Liberator's already been out for about 7 years. You already have an abolitionist movement kind of forming, and Douglass is a young guy, he's 21, walks into this. So the story goes, Douglass actually went to a meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. This would have been a sort of public lecture. And he was so impressed with what he heard, he gave a speech himself, and Garrison was bowled over by this guy. Unfortunately, we don't have any recordings of him, but the claim is, by people who were there, that he was a really gifted orator, that he could just hold an audience in the palm of his hand, that he had a really commanding personal presence, and told his story and what he had seen and what he had witnessed of slavery. And he had a real way with words. You know, one of his famous quotes, he used to start his speeches, "I appear before this immense assembly this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, and this body from my master and ran off with them." Now, if that isn't a way to really make somebody think about what slavery is and what taking your freedom means, I mean, that's pretty good. He wrote his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And he started his own newspaper. This is sometimes forgotten. Everybody remembers Garrison's Liberator, but they forget the North Star, which is Douglass's own newspaper that he begins actually for freed blacks as much as for other abolitionists. It's also worth noting, by the way, that he is as much in favor of women's rights as he is for freedom for blacks. He shows up at the Seneca Falls Convention and makes a nice speech on behalf of that. Now, not everybody took Douglass's attitude. Douglass, the other approach was that of this fellow, David Walker. Walker, in 1829, again, as you know from your books, wrote The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. He was a freed black in Boston who called for really a bloody armed rebellion. I mean, he was calling for a freedom fight, you know, military revolutionary struggle. So this is something that Garrison and Douglass were not calling for. So you had, again, a spectrum among the abolitionists. Garrison the radical, Douglass the radical, but nonviolent. Walker the radical and violent, the Free Soilers trying to find some sort of a middle ground. And then, as you know, and you can look at the picture in your book, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was an interesting woman. She had been born a slave. I'll pull up a picture. She had been born a slave in New York. She had been born a slave in upstate New York along the Hudson River, and had escaped, had obtained her freedom. She was also a great believer in women's rights. She had to go to court to get control and custody of her children. And she was an eloquent woman, not well educated, but eloquent, who chose that name for herself, by the way. Sojourner Truth was not her birth name. Sojourner means traveler, so traveler of truth. I noticed, by the way, at the bottom here, this, I sell the shadow to support the substance. The shadow that they're referring to is the shadow of the photograph, you know, light on a piece of paper that makes the photograph. And she used to travel around the country giving lectures, giving talks about slave life and about abolitionism, and it was very customary at the time to sell photographs afterwards. You would have these printed up and sell them for a small fee, and that was how she raised money to keep her lecture circuit going and keep the work of abolitionism going. Okay, so a couple of other items to note here. In your book, of course, the gag resolution. What do we do about all of this? the Congress tried to avoid the whole issue. You remember the 1832 nullification crisis that we talked about in some of the earlier chapters. Nat Turner's rebellion had rattled everybody. People remember the Haitian slave revolt that we have mentioned before in class. So the gag resolution was 1836. Was an attempt by Southerners to bar any discussion of slavery on the floor of the Congress, which, talk about the coward's way out. John Quincy Adams, which, if you recall, Adams had been the lawyer. Well, actually, it was a little later than this. Adams became the lawyer for the slaves of the Amistad. The Amistad was a slave ship where the slaves had rebelled and taken over the ship. They were put on trial, and John Quincy Adams volunteered to be their lawyer, and he got them all off. It was another one of these slave rebellions, people being treated in brutal conditions and really technically illegally, not just obviously immorally, but it was actually all in violation of the law, and so John Quincy Adams got them off. But the gag resolution, which Adams fought while a member of Congress. Another little fact about John Quincy Adams, by the way, your book just mentioned, doesn't even really explain it. John Quincy Adams served as President of the United States. After he was president, he then ran for the House of Representatives as a congressman. He's the only president who's ever done that. Normally, presidents, after they're presidents, they sort of retire and become, spokesmen and statesmen. John Quincy Adams couldn't get enough of government, and so after he was president, he went back and got himself elected to Congress. It's a long time before we hit him, but the only other guy who's comparable is William Howard Taft. After Taft was president, he was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which he was actually very good at. But anyway, the gag resolution was an attempt to just sort of find the coward's way out by not discussing any of this. Also point out that even though we talk about abolitionists, remember, they were only a small percentage of the population, even in the North. Most people in the North did not care much about slavery. It didn't affect them. It was a problem for the South. I don't want to get involved. Or they were positive supporters of it. We talked about the broadcloth mob in 1835 that attacked Garrison. And why did they attack him? Because if you screw around with the slave economy in the South, you're screwing around with the supply of cotton, which is screwing around with the mill industry. And up in Massachusetts, you had a lot of people dependent on that cotton from the South to make the mills go, to give jobs to the lower class people in Boston and the mill towns of like Lowell, Massachusetts, and Springfield and places like that. So just as during the American Revolution, you had people who were loyal to the Crown, to Great Britain. You had patriots who were loyal to the American cause, and an awful lot of people who didn't want to take a side or wanted to be left alone. So with this abolitionist movement, you had a small group of abolitionists in the North. I mean, they agitated a lot, they made a lot of noise, they pricked a lot of people's consciences, but in fact, they were only a small group. Most Northerners either did not really care or didn't see the slavery issue as relevant for them, or maybe they, didn't really like the slave thing, but they weren't really going to get too involved about it, or they were positive supporters of slavery in one way or another because they had an economic stake in seeing it continue. So there you go. That should give you a general idea. I urge you, and this is not hints and winks about the test or anything, but I urge you to take a look at the chronology on page 393, in addition to these folks and things that are mentioned on page 394. The chronology, I think, will help you understand a little bit about the development of how things got to where they were by the time we get to about 1850. I also want to urge you again, it's not necessary for the test on Tuesday, of course, but the more you reinforce this information, the better you're going to learn it. The more you're going to have to say should it show up on an essay, or the more you're going to have remembered something that shows up in a multiple choice question, if that's all you're looking for. If you're actually learning to learn some history, then this will also help you. And that's what I'm saying. For all of those groups, whether you're just looking to do well on the AP exam or whether you'd actually like to learn history, I mentioned in class the American Experience. It's a series on PBS. That's Channel 13 and Channel 21, and some of the other cable channels. You can look around and see what those are. In the American Experience series, it's also available on Netflix. It's often available on Netflix. I can't speak day to day for what's on Netflix, or on Amazon. The Amazon Prime, any of these movie services and things, look around for the American Experience. Any of the American Experience videos are good. They're all really good history. But they happen to have one called The Abolitionists, which I just mentioned because they've run it the last 2 weekends on Channel 13. So it's got to be around for you to look at. It's a really good overview of these folks. Anyway, so that should be hopefully something helpful for you. If you need help last minute, email me, and we will hopefully all be in school tomorrow on Tuesday, and we'll get this test done and move on. I also remind you, if you're still listening to this, that we really are on a very tight schedule of getting things done. So despite the fact that we've had some snow days, your reading assignments are still in force. They're still what they are, because if we don't continue pushing through the material in the reading, we're not going to get through everything you need by the time that AP exam comes along. Okay, great. Thanks.